Margaret Wheatley, in her book, Turning to One Another, Simple Conversations to Restore Hope to the Future, writes, a young Black South African woman taught some of my friends the healing power of listening. She was sitting in a circle of women from many nations, and each woman had a chance to tell a story from her life. When her turn came, she began to quietly tell a story of true horror, how she had found her grandparents slaughtered in their village. Many of the women were Westerners, and in the presence of such pain, they instinctively wanted to do something. They wanted to fix, to make it better, anything to remove the pain of this tragedy from such a young life. The young woman felt their compassion, but she also felt them closing in, and she put up her hands as if to push back their desire to help. She said, I don't need you to fix me. I need you to listen to me. Those words really hit me. I don't need you to fix me. I need you to listen to me. Margaret Wheatley helped me understand that we are not alone in our desire to be helpful, to want to make things better and be fixers. But I want to honestly think about being heard. Think about what it's in your life at a time when you felt being heard. Maybe it's recent, maybe it was a long time ago. I want you to think about what it feels like to know you are deeply listened to, and how it feels like when you can simply sit quietly with someone and not fill the space or not have them fill the space. Where does that take your heart? Do you have a sense of calm and safety? Do you have a sense of trust to find your own way? As Katie said, Paul Tillich writes, the first duty of love is to listen. Of course, you may think. We are, after all, a church community that prides itself on welcome and care for one another. Surely listening to one another is a core part of that reality. And it is. And there are ways we fall short on that first duty of love. My hope is that today's reflection won't be an admonishment or a way to shame those of us who struggle with deep listening. Instead, I hope it will be an invitation. I'll offer you some images and stories to hold on to and think about what deep listening means in terms of a practice of love and relationship. Parker Palmer, who many of you may know, a Quaker and a writer, says, advice giving comes naturally to our species and it is mostly done with good intent. But in my experience, the driver behind a lot of advice has as much to do with self-interest as interest in the other's need. He speaks of a friend of his who sent a group email out to his friends and family sharing about his cancer diagnosis. He stated that he was feeling amazingly at peace and not worried about what lied ahead. Well, one of his friends replied, and I'm sure you have seen this happen in the past, with a list of what he thought this man should do. Get a second opinion. Start exploring complementary medicines. Sign up for meditation. Hey, I have a book I think you might want to read. Has this happened to you? Have you watched it with others? Have you been flooded with the need tos, the shoulds, the have you tried or did you, whatever? If you have, did it deepen your sense of peace and gratitude, or did it do something else? Maybe it caused you to shut down or feel defensive. Maybe it caused you to actually mentally leave the conversation, even though you may have physically remained. I've watched myself and others look like they've been struck by a tidal wave and are drowning in all that is given to me or to someone else when they share something vulnerable. Returning to that same man who was diagnosed with cancer, Parker Palmer talks about asking his friend how he was feeling later on in his diagnosis. And his friend confessed that he'd been feeling afraid. Parker asked him, do you want to talk about your fear? Parker shared how the man talked while he listened and asked a few more questions. And then Parker reflected and said, when we were done, he said a measure of peace had returned. It was a peace that had come from within him, not from anything I'd said. I'd simply helped him clear some rubble that blocked his access to his soul. So the first duty of love is to listen. Listening happens on several levels. It happens internally when we listen to that small voice inside, or we're listening to our own wrestling around an emotion or an issue. It happens between us when we're in relationship with one another, and it happens on a larger organizational level as a we. Originally, I intended this service to be more around an organizational level, talking about how the Unitarian Universalist Association has listened to voices that have been marginalized and is shifting drastically at this period of time. I will return to that at another service, but as you'll be able to tell from the stories today, we're really looking at the interpersonal aspect of listening today instead. There's several ways that we as a church community build listening into our way of being together as a congregation today, for each other's joys and sorrows. Having been at large congregations for several decades, I was used to having joys and sorrows submitted to the minister and read from the pulpit. I have to say, as somebody in that congregation, I often had no idea who they were speaking of. That person could have been sitting next to me for all I knew. Here, the person who is experiencing the joy or the sorrow shares, we see you, we hear you, we experience your words and the way you say them. Creating that space in a service helps us recognize that we are not alone in our joy and pain. Week after week, we hear of so many aspects of the human condition. We listen, letting our hearts align with the person who shares, and perhaps finding ourselves being reminded of our own joys and sorrows. More recently, due to COVID-19 and the reality of virtual services, I deliberately cut the length of sermons. Some of you may have noticed. Early advice was that a 20-minute sermon online does not fly, and so instead, sermons or reflections are now in the 10 to 12-minute frame on a good Sunday, and we built in time for your voices to be heard in response. You share your own truths and experiences and ways that you found your way to a greater truth, hope. You share your doubts, you share your questions, your love, and your resilience. Sometimes this takes a form of what I call testifying. Testifying is in making a statement of belief or bearing witness on something that is true to you. Recently, as some have spoken about already, our new second Saturday storytelling nights have proved a way to create windows into each other's lives. Sometimes hearing someone's story mirrors your own experience, and other times it opens up great learning and understanding. Last night's storytelling ended up on the topic, the storytelling topic was deep listening, but the conversation moved into a place of talking about losing someone to suicide and what or if anything can be done to prevent such a tragedy. The upcoming small group offerings will also provide a way to be heard and to listen, where you can tell your stories without being interrupted or fixed. I've been in a number of such groups, and I continue to be part of a Monday night circle of peace that functions by passing a talking stick. When we're on Zoom, we get called on. There's no crosstalk, ever. And I know from experience how uncomfortable this can sometimes be, both as the person who is speaking, who gets no feedback, and as the person who's listening. I'm also so grateful for the discipline and the discomfort. It interrupts what I might call normal conversation patterns, and it forces me to experience being listened to and listening very differently. What I've discovered is those of us who have been or are in helping professions or problem-solving professions may have a greater challenge checking our desire to fix when listening. Fixing is what we are paid for or were paid for. It's a honed skill, and it's rewarded in the workplace for many of us. When I entered into clinical pastoral education, which is called CPE, where I served as a student chaplain in a hospital, I was told that my previous careers as a career counselor and internship director, as well as an executive director of small nonprofits, would likely get in my way of good listening. Resistant to that message, I observed what was going on inside me during that period of time. You see, providing counsel to college students involves listening, but the expectation is also that you'll provide tools and resources to guide the student. And being an executive director meant I had to be decisive, manage a staff, and provide direct feedback as well as guidance. Guidance sounds so benign, and I gave it with love and listened carefully to the recipient's response. But to listen deeply, I had to shift the way I showed up. I had to drop those skills and discover new ones that required me to remain quiet and to ask questions that had no ulterior motive, such as getting them to the answer that I knew was best for them. I had to sit with their joy and pain and try not to repackage it or shift it or sugarcoat it. I had to just be present. And that, my friends, is not easy for many of us. I began a practice of pausing outside hospital room doors, taking deep breaths to center myself and to clear my mind and open my heart. I prayed to get out of my own way and to help center the patient's story. I prayed to silence my insecurities or overconfidence and to provide space to simply listen and ask questions that would open stories even more. It wasn't easy, and it was most rewarding when I was able to be truly present. The reward was not, dang, I gave great advice, or I really helped that person figure it out, or I knew so much and had so much to offer. Instead, the reward was watching another person find their way to their own strength or peace, to let them hear themselves speak truths into the room and give space and breath so that they might examine what they said and decide for themselves whether it was helpful or not. I often share what my dear friend Reverend Kate Tucker wrote about grief when I lead memorial services. She wrote that it helps to know your feelings can be complex and multiple. Sorrow and relief, love and anger, despair and hope, and live together as a yo-yo in astonishing ways. It helps when you can welcome all the feelings, show hospitality, ask them to tea. It helps to give sorrow to words, to tell your heart to those who know how to listen and love you, the ones who don't mind at all when you repeat yourself. Some of our deep stories need repeating and actually move in incremental ways as we tell it over and over again. So what if we all provided that graciousness to one another as we share the complexity of our own lives and experiences? What if instead of telling people what to do or try to fix them or advise them, we simply invite them metaphorically to tea, to settle into the slow and abundant pace of quiet time together, caring for our bodies as we care for our hearts and souls? What if we opted to simply be there for one another? Just be there and let it be as it is. It makes me feel calm even talking about it. So what if instead of offering advice, we asked first, do you want my feedback or advice? How empowering it would it be if the person being heard could say, no. It'd be a lot to deal with on the other side, but it's a good thing to experience. More times than not, that is what we seek, is just to be heard. What if after we share something, we feel empowered to say, I'd prefer not to have advice or responses? Sit with that for a minute. What if you were able to ask if simply listening was enough? In some of the groups I've been in and led, people are asked to ask clarifying questions, questions that aren't directing a person towards your desired answer, or one that might steer a person in a direction they weren't actually going. Instead, these are curious questions, asking for clarification and mirroring the language of the person versus interjecting your own language. I can tell you that there were several times, even last week, as I spoke to congregants, I fell short in what I am speaking of. It is easy for me to fall in the trap of being a minister, which, by the way, is a group of people who are notoriously bad at this practice. I'm often being turned to for resources and directions, and I'm a bit of a resource queen, and I pride myself on this web of connections I've established over the years. But what if I literally practiced what I preach and simply listen? What if I asked, do you need resources, or would you like my opinion, before I gave them? Honestly, I didn't end those conversations feeling good about my ministry. Instead, I left them feeling sorry that I had not allowed more silence and breath and discovery to emerge. I believe we have the dancers deep within us. I believe that our direct experience provides a well of wisdom that can guide us towards being better human beings and community members. I believe the holy is indeed present when one's whole self can emerge and relationships are formed from deep love and compassion. I'll close with the wisdom of Margaret Wheatley. Why is being heard so healing? I don't know the full answer to that question, but I do know it has something to do with the fact that listening creates relationship. We know from science that nothing in the universe exists as isolated or an independent entity. Everything takes form from relationships, be it subatomic particles sharing energy or ecosystems sharing food. In the web of life, nothing lives alone. It's impossible to create a culture if we refuse to meet and if we refuse to listen. But if we meet, and when we listen, we reweave the world into wholeness and holiness. I'm going to reread that last sentence. But if we meet, when we listen, we reweave the world into wholeness and holiness. That was a hard last sentence. Blessed be and amen. So I'm curious, dear ones, if you have reflections on deep listening, if anything, earlier in the story, whether it's the kids in the service, whether it's the kids' story or joys and sorrows, or last night with deep listening, if anything has caused you to stop and reflect on the topic of this deep listening. We will do exactly what we do during joys and sorrows. We'll look for hands. You can put your little hand up on the screen, or you can write something in chat. And we will take it from there. The tech people will have to read if there's something in chat because I'm on my iPhone and that's just not easy to deal with.
Lynn, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Reverend Laura's remarks gave me a lot to think about because I come from the same background as she does. I was an academic advisor and career counselor and program director for probably close to 40 years. And she's right. You get in the habit of automatically assuming that you have to give advice. But a couple times in my life, I've stumbled into situations where I knew I did not have a solution. I just did not. And all I could do was listen. And I was amazed at the power of that, where my only responsibility was to sit with the person and listen. And and watch them work through it themselves. Because what I come to realize is that giving advice is saying to someone, I know better than you do.
Mm.
And the truth is, I don't. And if you can just listen to people, that empowers them to work through their own solutions. And that is so much more meaningful than anything that I could say. So I'm just astonished at the power of deep listening, and I'm hoping I can develop those skills a lot better than I have.
Thank you, Lynn. Actually, I was thinking of you because I was in higher ed as well. So as I was writing this, looks like Katie had a hand up.
So one thing that comes to my mind is I just remember growing up, my mom kind of in her optimism, I guess, would always kind of be of the mind of everything is going to work out. And that just has stuck with me as a, like, you can't know that. And so oddly enough, that's a thing that I sort of catch myself on when, if someone, in particular the kids or, a good friend who's maybe upset about something, like I'm sort of not able to say everything will be all right because of that, because I just disagreed with it when I heard it. And so it in some ways forces me into, okay, I can't be reassuring in that way. All I can do is be here to acknowledge, the situation they're in, and that it is difficult. And so that, I don't know, seems sort of related, but that's what came to my mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Katie.
I'm not seeing any other hands, but if you'd like to speak, go ahead and unmute yourself.
This is Janice, and this is something that I've been struggling with for the last couple of years, particularly with my daughter and her being in California and me being in Minnesota. And when she calls and is upset about something or needs to talk about something, as a mother, I want to just immediately fix it for her. And I'm slowly learning to just mostly listen. But I'm also finding that I somewhat want it reciprocated. So I will tend to reach out to her every once in a while and ask her to just listen. So I think in a certain sense, I need to just reach out and say, I need somebody to just listen to me and not give me any advice and not do anything. Just listen to what I have to say. And two thoughts immediately come to mind with that. One is from my daughter. And that was, at one point I was trying to tell her and give her some advice. And she said, Mom, let me make my own mistakes. And I think about that frequently. The other thing was at a workshop that I had at work, which was with Roseville area schools. There was a speaker that came in one time and talked about admiring the problem. And basically what that means is that you just need to talk about it. You might need to repeat yourself and do it 3 or 4 times, but all you want is somebody to listen so that you can repeat whatever the grievance is or whatever the problem is, so that it kind of, you're talked out on the subject. So for me, this deep listening month has been just a reflection of kind of what I've been going through. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that, admiring the problem. And I think that reality of paying attention to ourselves, whether it's a parent or a sibling or a friend or a neighbor, and what is it in us that wants to offer advice? Like what is that in us? And can we quiet that and see what happens, right? It's not easy. It's a hard practice.
I see Polly's hand.
Yeah, you know, with the loss of Kathleen, I've had both instances of really wonderful deep listening where people just their heart is open to me, and that's one of the best healing things I can have. I've also had bad listening where people either offer solutions or say something that bounces my pain off of them. Something like, I understand, when they don't, or something like, you know, God will never give you anything you can't handle, because that's not true either for me. But some of the best healing I've had is when I myself deep listen to somebody who's been through what I'm going through, somebody like Beth Strootman, who puts her heart out there and has her experience. And if I'm able to just deep listen to that, that can help me more than anything.
Get back on that frame.
Thank you, Polly.
This is Marilyn.
I think the reality of sometimes when listening doesn't feel so good, it may be that the intention is good, but the impact is painful. Because I believe we actually all intend to do, give care and love to each other, but sometimes it may have an impact that doesn't feel that way.
I heard Marilyn. Did you have something? No.
Yeah, this is Marilyn. What I've learned to do, because my job required me to go in and immediately fix a problem, and so then that transferred into my personal life, and I really have had to work at that, is to combine the deep breathing, the pause, to learn how to do that. And also my mother's one of the best listeners possible. I can come to her house and the world has completely crashed in, and she just sits there and she doesn't say, well, you should do this, or you should. Not that she hasn't, but she doesn't. So that's my.
Marilyn, I love that practice of breath, and I practice that as well. And I also have an old friend who is a total extrovert, and she spoke about when she was in class in school, she always had to sit on her hand because otherwise hers was the first one to go up all the time. So sometimes I imagine myself to sit on your hands, even though it means keeping my mouth shut and my heart open, but it's an image for me that reminds me that going like this isn't always the best way to proceed in learning or in being with one another. Thank you, Marilyn.
Jamie, did you have something? Yeah, Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Reverend Laura, you asked, you said you don't know why this happens exactly. About why deep listening is such a powerful tool. And it can be a very spiritual experience, and it leads to deep spiritual connection between people. But science now knows why this works. When we are highly traumatized and in a flight, fight, or freeze mode, our prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain here, right in our forehead, which has judgment and reasoning and language and problem solving, it goes offline basically. And when we listen to someone and give them that catharsis and calm their emotions down, we enable that prefrontal cortex basically becomes functional again, and they're able to do their own problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
It's
what a gift.
A miraculous kind of experience.
Thank you, Jamie. May we be that gift for one another. I'm going to move on, and I hope that those of you who have more to share will stay afterwards. Okay, go ahead, Marie.
I would like to say one thing. This was years ago. I was in a support group, when I was divorced, and I was in a support group, and I made this very good friend. And there was one time we were having, I don't know, some sort of a training session, and there were about 6 of us in there, and people were listening to me, and when I got done talking, my friend didn't give me advice, but she made an observation. She said, Marie, when you're talking about something really painful and sad, you smile.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never realized that. And to this day, I find myself, if I'm really upset, I will start smiling, and that sort of clicks in. And I realized I probably was doing that to not feel the pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the things that deep listening does, at least it has for me, is it helps me open up and feel the pain and learn from it, not stay stuck, although I have, and then move on. I think that's one of the benefits of deep listening.
Thank you, Marie. As I said, let's take these into small groups. If you'd like to stay and share in a more intimate way, we'd love to have you remain and go into breakout groups after the service. We'll now sing Breaking Out the Circle.